that is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you. Dr. Seuss. Very good. Gold star. Yes. I love Dr. Seuss. He has such a beautiful way of making profound truths simple and easy to digest. With a smile and a silly rhyme, he pulls back the layers of a thing and exposes the heart of the matter. There is no one alive who is youer than you. Here, the underlying sentiment of Dr. Seuss's words is the encouragement to what your mother always told you, be yourself. All right? It's a classic piece of advice, but it's one of those that is often harder to follow. Easier said than done. First, it requires you to know who you are. It requires you to own your you-ness, which is not always easy to do. And then there's the courage that's needed to live into the fullness of that you-ness in a world that can be harsh and harmful. Just being yourself can be a difficult thing, because navigating this world of expectations and preconceived notions can be really, really hard. But this idea of courageously being the you that God created you to be kept coming to my mind this week as I read and studied the book of Esther. Not just because of what happens within the part of the story that we read this morning, but also because of the larger questions that this quirky little book raises about what it means to be a book of the Bible. The book of Esther defies expectations at every turn. So a few weeks ago, when I was starting to put this Esther series together, the title for this week's message was going to be A Radical No, in honor of Queen Vashti's radical defiance of the king when she refused to come at his beck and call. She refused to come and put on a show while wearing the royal diadem. Now, for those of you who don't know, most scholars agree that this order to put on a show while wearing the royal crown was a command for her to come while wearing only the royal crown. The show that she was supposed to put on was not that great. Now, it's unclear what price she paid for refusing this order, other than that she wasn't going to be queen anymore. I assume if she had been executed, the author would have told us this, considering there's details of another execution later on, which we'll get to. But the fear of death for refusing the king wasn't out of the realm of possibility. But even so, Vashti stood up to the king. And by doing this, by standing up to the most powerful man in the world, she defied every imaginable convention of her time. She refused to be objectified, and she claimed ownership of her own body. She used this position of power to make a statement, and even though we never get to hear her voice, her actions speak volumes. And while there are a few other examples of women in the Bible refusing to do a man's bidding, these other women are more subversive. While Vashti is bold, she blatantly defies the command of the most powerful man in the empire. Even if in the story that man is portrayed more as a drunken buffoon than a respected leader, it still was a bold statement to make. So internally, within the story, within this section of the story we just read, we have this powerful example of a woman defying expectations and daring to be herself no matter the cost. But instead of a radical no, this larger idea of defying expectations kept coming to mind. Because the book of Esther is just as amazing for the way that it defies our expectations of what a book of the Bible should be. Now, I can only speak for myself, but I tend to approach the Bible with a sense of gravitas, right? This is the word of the Lord, so we should handle it with respect and seriousness and the care that it deserves, right? This is how we treat the Bible. Which is true to some extent because the Bible can be pretty heavy. Not just literally because it's a big book, but figuratively. It deals with some pretty heavy stuff. It can be our companion in times of uncertainty and a source of comfort in despair. We can find the depths of human suffering in this book. And I am not one to shy away from the heavy. I like heavy books. I like holding the heaviness of our lives in the light of God's grace. But in a few weeks, we will be entering the season of Lent. We will be entering fully into this heavy season that leads us to the grave. It's heavy stuff. So until then, now is why I decided to spend some time with Esther for the next few weeks. She is funny, and she is unexpected. She doesn't fit our mold for what a serious book of the Bible should be. How many of you have read Esther recently? Let's say within the past 5 years, all the way through. Oh, good. Oh, look at that. All right, we're going to see if we can get more hands up by the end of this. Because as I was putting this study together, it was really hard to just pick some verses because it is such a good story. In Esther, we don't have any prophets warning of calamity. There are no long lists of names tracing everyone's lineage back to Adam and Eve. There aren't any very detailed accounts of battles, and there's no annals of kingly triumphs or misdeeds. So you should read it because it is a good story and none of that other stuff to slog you down. Esther shows us that we don't have to always be so serious when we come to the Bible. That playfulness and humor can be holy and powerful reminders of God's grace with us. That playfulness itself is a gift from God. And we see this playfulness of Esther almost from the very beginning. Think about that description we had of the court. You can go back and read it. The over-the-top description of the banquet pokes fun at the opulence and the decadence of the Persian court. Linens of purple and white hung on silver rings. There were gold and silver couches, which don't sound very comfortable to me, but they definitely are a good way to display wealth. And these couches sit on a mosaic floor that's made from semi-precious gemstones. And to top it all off, each goblet made out of gold was each crafted from its own unique form. No two were alike. With this description, the author is painting the equivalent of a political cartoon. It's a lampoon of the Persian court, and it centers around this fictional king. You see, there is no historical record for any Persian king named Ahasuerus. He doesn't exist anywhere outside of the book of Esther. Some of you have been waiting to object, but wait, isn't King Ahasuerus actually King Xerxes? Well, maybe. Some people have argued that Ahasuerus really is King Xerxes, who came to power around 460 BC, for those of you who like historical records. And some translations have even changed Ahasuerus' name to Xerxes. Xerxes is in the NIV translation. And I can see the logic of this argument, right? It's a wise move. Because if you're going to poke fun at the king, it makes sense to change his name, right? That way, if the king comes after you, what can you say? It's just a story, right? It's not you. Credible deniability. But just because this could be the case doesn't mean that it is the case. Ahasuerus could be a pseudonym for Xerxes, or he could just as easily be a composite character, a stand-in for all of the Persian emperors, or even all of the rulers that had ever had a hand in exiling and ruling over Israel. Instead of being a historical figure, Ahasuerus could just be a foil, a drunken buffoon that is easily swayed by the suggestions of others. In this role, he highlights the faithfulness and the courage and the wisdom and the heroicism of the Jewish main characters in the story. Right? The king Ahasuerus, this fictional king, is a comedic character that allows the Jewish people to poke fun and laugh at those who rule over them. This is a way for them to feel empowered and to take some control of a situation that is far from under their control. This is the playful offering of Esther. It doesn't seem to fit with its weightier canonical counterparts. So we find this move to legitimate Esther by making her fit into this preconceived notion of what Holy Scripture should be. And this starts with trying to equate the fictional king Ahasuerus with the real king Xerxes. Trying to make this equal that is part of a larger move to make the book of Esther something that it is not. Inserting the name of the real king into the story is an attempt to make Esther sound more historical, to make her fit in with the rest of the Holy Scriptures. And it goes beyond just a name change. Beyond the simple name change of the king, we also see this attempt to make Esther appear more biblical by some versions adding 6 extra chapters to her story and changing a few other details. This is why I encourage you to read Esther and read it from as many translations and versions as you can get your hands on. Now, many of you may know the fun fact that Esther is one of only 2 books that doesn't mention or reference something pretty important. What would that be? God, right? God is never referenced in the book of Esther, depending on what version you read. Because some versions do reference God. There are actually 2 versions of Esther. There is one that is derived from the earliest Hebrew manuscripts, and this is the version that most English Bibles have, and it's the one that we'll be reading from. But there is another version found in the Greek Septuagint, and I will buy you dinner if you can spell Septuagint. Dave Anderson. And the Septuagint is the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So we have the earliest Hebrew versions and the earliest Greek versions, very different translations. And the Greek version has 6 additions that are not found in the Hebrew text. It's like someone took the Hebrew version of Esther and they inserted these 6 extra passages into the main story to make her sound more biblical. These 6 additions include a prophetic dream, a prayer of intervention, detailed accounts of both the royal edicts that were issued to make it sound more historical, and a coda at the end that says, in the 4th year of the reign of such and such real kings, so-and-so claiming to be a priest, and his son brought this letter, the book of Esther, translated by this one guy's son. This ending that makes it sound official and heavy and real. But sometimes what is real is not always factual. What is truth is sometimes not the same thing as fact. It seems as though these things were added to give Esther an air of legitimacy, that sense of biblical gravitas that was missing before in the playfulness of who she was. Now, several English translations include these additions in line with the book as a whole. The Catholic Bible includes this version of Esther. And other editions of the Bible include these additions in a completely separate section of the Bible where we kind of put books that didn't quite make the cut into the final edit. But all of this raises the question of why can't we just let Esther be who she is? Why can't we accept her quirky and her irreverent humor without trying to make her something into something she's not? Why can't we let this book simply be an entertaining story told by people living under the occupation of a foreign empire? What's so wrong about reading it as a funny narrative shared by a people living in exile or newly returned from it, but still living under the thumb of an empire that they did not choose? By her very presence in the Bible, Esther shows us how to not take ourselves too seriously, and how doing this is an act of defiance, of holy defiance. Esther teaches us that learning how to laugh is just as sacred as learning how to pray. By defying our expectations of what holiness should be, Esther opens us up and frees us to the power of what holiness can be. I'm excited to spend these next 5 weeks with you learning about what Esther has to teach us, to see if she can show us a truth that is truer than true. That God treasures our playfulness and takes profound delight in the you that is you. May God bless us on this journey and lead us in the paths of playfulness. Amen.